rising biotech competition from China. How should U.S. life sciences companies approach the challenge? And in Washington, the first round of cuts has torpedoed FDA morale, with more firings expected. We will discuss what FDA staffers are calling the Valentine's Day Massacre and looking for signs of life in the IPO market. I'm Jeff Cranmer, Executive Editor at BioCentury. This is the BioCentury This Week podcast. And joining me to discuss all of this are my colleagues
Simona Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
And Paul Bonanos, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
All right. Simone, you made a trip up to New York last week. Great city. I was hoping to see you on the SNL 50-year anniversary program, but I did not. But you did pop up at the Bio CEO and Investor Forum, and you did a fireside chat with John Maraganore, the former and longtime CEO of Alnylam, who's on all manner of boards and is the chairman of City Therapeutics. What did you talk about?
Well, first of all, Jeff, I do want to say that while I was in New York, very close to where the event was, there really were these huge lines. And I thought it's fantastic that everybody's coming to hear this fireside chat. And then it actually occurred to me, but maybe they were there for the SNL 50 event rather than specifically this fireside chat. But they were the ones to miss out, I would say, because it was a really interesting conversation. And, you know, John is always very thoughtful. But one thing I want to talk about, and this actually bled into some of my other conversations that I had in New York with people on Wall Street and a couple of VC firms, is really about the competition from China. And, you know, John had a very important statement. He said that he is hearing a lot of concern in boardrooms, and he thinks that that concern is the way people are reacting is wrong. He says we should embrace this kind of competition, that competition is good. It will push people to do more and better things rather than run away from it. And, you know, his view is that we should respond to this innovation coming from another country and say, what do we have to do to be even more competitive than they are? He said it makes us work harder, it makes us think about cost and price. He talked about ways that the US could respond at a structural level by making it easier to get into the clinic faster or expedite IRB approvals. But he also was really referring to an individual level where he hears a lot of concern among biotech CEOs. And one thing I want to add is, you know, to me, that's quite obvious. But what I'm understanding more and more is that that was actually quite a controversial statement, that a lot of people don't think that. And Steve, I just want to know what you think about that.
So it's the definition of a good idea. The definition of a good idea is it's something that I've already said in the past, and he agrees with it.
And I've actually already told people it's going to happen, by the way. So there you go. Yeah.
So when I was writing about Biosecure, I wrote the Biosecure Act, which was aimed at decoupling the U.S. and the Chinese biopharmaceutical industries, which did not pass last year, but hasn't died forever. I wrote that it's an enormous mistake to think that American public policy should be predicated on the idea that we can or should retard advances in biomedicine in China, and that the only way that we're going to stay on top is to outcompete China. And it's not possible, and I contend it's not even desirable or moral, to try to prevent China from benefiting from advances in biotechnology. But it is possible for us to be far more competitive than we are. And the discussion in Washington and the discussion in boardrooms should be around what can and must the United States do to advance biomedical research and development and product development more rapidly. And if we do that, then there'll be a kind of virtuous competition with China.
And Steve, you know, why is this controversial?
It's controversial because there's geopolitical tension between the United States and China. One of the very few things in Washington that people on both sides of the aisle agree on is rivalry or antagonism between the United States and China that's rooted in trade disputes. It's rooted in concerns over human rights. It's rooted in rivalry for influence in developing countries. And it's spilled over into biotech. And another way that I think that's pernicious, that is really harmful that it's spilled over into biotech, is it's also led to a suspicion that Chinese scientists who were born in China or have their origins in China can't be trusted. During the first Trump administration, there was quite a bit of investigation of Chinese scientists, and some of it was merited and a great deal of it wasn't. I think that on the whole, the United States has benefited immensely from an influx of Chinese students who have come to the United States, from Chinese scientists who have participated in the biopharma industry. And on balance, if you look at what the concerns are, that we're much better off to continue having a flow and a dialogue with China than decoupling.
So I do agree with that. And I want to now bring it back to the company level and what those people can do and what they're looking at. Because one thing you hear, or I have to be honest, you hear it less and less. You hear this idea that, in China, they're just fast followers. Our colleague Karen Tkach-Tuzman has actually written a piece that is not going to be the case for long. A lot of first mover discovery work is also coming out of China. And most people actually realize the amount of innovation rather than sort of improvements on innovation. I think we've all moved beyond the Me Too idea. But, one thing that I've been talking about with people, and we're going to be writing more about, is biotechs. We've seen this wave of newcos, right, and deals that go from east to west. And what that means is Western VCs and farmers are going to China and they're finding assets and they're putting money into those assets at the expense, meaning they're not doing that for local biotechs in Kendall Square or wherever. And so that is a new source of competition. There are a few ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, why is that happening? So on the one hand, there's a cost arbitrage, which won't last forever. But at the moment, you can still get similar assets for less. So Western companies are going to have to start realizing that maybe they are overpriced if you can get equally good innovation and assets from Asia. The second part of it is not just the speed at which China companies are moving ahead, but also the rate at which they can get clinical data. And that clinical data is now not what it was 5 or 10 years ago. People recognize that clinical data. This is to your point, Steve, about the quality of the research coming out of China. People now recognize that as being good quality data that they will put money behind. And so, John Maraganore had pointed out how can structurally it be made easier for people to get into humans faster and still safely, of course, to compete. And that's going to be an ongoing challenge. Then there's a third part of this, actually, which I don't know how they address, but China companies can license these great assets and they will give up US rights. But no US company can give up the US rights to their asset or they kill their company. So I think that there are various things going into this. And what we've seen, and I think we're going to see more of, is the smart companies in the West are going to your point, Steve, they're going to harness this. They're going to partner with them. They're going to find ways to remain both ahead and competitive and not sort of run away from it or try to stop it happening. But I just wonder if we're going to start to see some creative deal making. I don't know, Paul, if you've been looking at this at all, with any of the terms. But I think that this issue of how to face this competition happens at both a policy level, like you're talking about, Steve, and then at a very localized company level.
And it's also another dimension of it is manufacturing. It's much less expensive and much less onerous to create manufacturing capacity in China than it is in the United States. I think that's one area where we're going to see some changes. I think we're going to see under the Trump administration incentives, carrots and sticks for companies to do more manufacturing, including biopharmaceutical companies, to do more manufacturing in the United States. And I think that probably has had something to do with China's ability to innovate so quickly. Their kind of integration of R&D and manufacturing, especially in areas like cell therapies, where the two things are inextricably linked.
Yeah, so China really flipped a switch in 2015 with a lot of policy reforms. And at that point, it's when we really started to see, as Simone mentioned, the deal flow increasing with Western companies in licensing rights to Chinese assets. And during that time, again, as Simone mentioned, shout out to Karen here, our colleague Karen's look in the Innovation Distillery at papers with near-term potential for translation into therapeutics. China moved from a distant second to parity with the US last year. And I do want to go over to Paul in a second to ask about what he is seeing in terms of China deal flow and the prices of assets. But I wanted to ask you first, Simone, what was the tipping point? Is it this NewCo model that we've been writing about? You know, at the beginning of the year, we saw 5 of these companies. We defined the NewCo model as Chinese assets being formed into Western-based new companies, typically with US or European VC money. Has that been the tipping point for these concerns over China innovation?
Yeah, I think that's right. So first of all, this is the reason why everybody should be subscribing to BioCentury, because you're right. We have been covering this for a while, and we've seen this flow of deals like farmers accessing assets. That has been on the radar of pharma BD leaders. You know, I did an interview with James Sabry when he was head of partnering at Roche. I mean, this was a couple of years ago on the BioCentury show. So that's been going on a while, but it is this sudden spate within the last year in particular. That is VC money that's now going to these assets, and it is on everybody's radar. I have so many people saying, how we've talked about this on other episodes, right? How can I get to such and such a conference to meet these people? I want to say just one last thing. When I've had these discussions, there are areas where the Western ecosystem still has many advantages, and that is why they're seeding some of these companies here. I think their interaction and understanding of the regulatory system is at the moment ahead. The US FDA, I'm talking about here. And, you know, I think there's still a lot more experience and expertise in the latter stages of drug development, clinical development. That is, again, maybe only a matter of time. But I think that I don't want to paint this picture that the US is falling behind so much, because I do think that there are a lot of real advantages that companies and innovators here have, and they just need to figure out how to leverage them. Paul, how are you looking at this?
Well, I have run some numbers on this, and hopefully we'll get around to publishing something pretty soon about it too. Everything you say has been correct. The prices
love
are
it. That's why we
coming
keep them
up.
around, right?
The prices of assets in licensed from China by Western biopharmas have come up. Deal flow has come up way, way up. There was really a trickle as of about 2019. The last 3 years compared to the previous 3 years are night and day. Let's put it that way. And in the early going in 2025, if it feels like deal flow has been up this year for in-licensings from China, the numbers appear to support that so far.
And what are you seeing in terms of the price of Chinese assets, Paul?
It's not quite at parity with those from the West, but it's coming up.
All right. Let's take a quick break, and then we will turn to Washington.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company returned to Singapore for the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit. This year's theme, how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border deals to the NewCo model. Meet key players from across Asia's emerging arc of innovation, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. Don't wait, deals are closing every week. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
We're back. Steve, you worked all weekend. We told you to take the weekend off. What got you to your desk? Why were you on the phone all weekend?
Firings. The firings started Friday late afternoon and went on into the day Saturday. They were at NIH. They were at FDA. They were aimed primarily, but not exclusively, at what are called probationary employees. These are employees who have been on the job typically for less than a year, in some cases less than 2 years. Hundreds of people fired from FDA, way more than 1,000 fired at NIH. We can talk about where the firings were and what effects that they're going to have. My top line on it is, people who are listening to this are probably wondering for FDA, well, is this going to mean that FDA is going to start missing PDUFA deadlines for drugs and biologics? And the answer is no. The cuts that have been made so far are not likely to have that impact. They are likely to have much more severe impacts on FDA's ability to review devices, including companion diagnostics and other devices that are critical for the biopharmaceutical industry. But the way I would look at it is that this is a first wave. It's far from over. The most serious damage has been first at CDC, which has really been hurt really very, very badly. Its abilities eroded much more than anywhere else. 2 at NIH, and then 3 at FDA. As far as drug review at FDA is concerned, this first round is what I call vandalism. It's approaching arson at CDC, and it's really serious at NIH. Just speaking about drugs at FDA, it hasn't had as big an impact, but the individuals who have been fired, and I've spoken with several of them over the weekend, of course, it's devastating for them and for their lives. And
Steve, I want to ask you, I think many people in the corporate world have been through layoffs. Everybody knows how traumatic that is. It is also for the people who remain. So you might be listening to this and think, well, that happens in the business world. It's painful, but you have to go through it. But tell us from a drug development point of view, what the impact of this sort of low morale on the people remaining, why is that an issue beyond the immediate impact of losing colleagues?
Yeah, well, so first, I don't think that there's any company where, certainly in the biopharma industry, where people are fired on an arbitrary basis with no notice.
I understood and agree with that. I don't think the method of the firing, by the way, is something that meant.
So it's a different thing. But here, so look at it this way. Look, at FDA, the immediate effect of this, I think, for drugs, it's not going to be that drug reviews are going to go away or that they're going to slow to a crawl necessarily. But I think that it will have an impact, and probably in the short term, it'll create what I call a kind of malaise at FDA, where people will be much more risk averse. And we've seen this before. Back when Viax was withdrawn and there was huge controversy about FDA, it's not like reviews stopped, but what happened is that reviewers were much less willing to take risks. They're going to demand more evidence of safety, more evidence of efficacy before they are willing to sign off on something, because nobody at FDA is publicly criticized or fired because they haven't approved something or hadn't moved to approve something that should have been approved. But if they make a mistake, if something gets approved that it later turns out that the harms outweigh the benefits, or there's a public backlash against it, then there are consequences for them. Similarly, for the development of policy, of guidances, of new innovative policies, of ways to, for example, incorporate artificial intelligence better into FDA's own activities, and also to regulate AI in the biopharmaceutical industry, those kinds of things have suffered an immediate setback. There's going to be a real reluctance and a lack of ability at FDA to create new innovative policies.
Steve, I'm curious what the impact on the leadership is.
The quick answer is we don't know. There's a lot of concern in the biopharmaceutical industry that Peter Marks might be marked for being pushed out of FDA. I know that the industry has gone to great lengths to try to persuade the Trump administration not to do that. There have been calls to Trump's chief of staff. There have been calls to RFK Jr., to the people around Musk, trying to ensure that Peter Marks is allowed to stay and to lead CBER. It remains to be seen whether that will be successful. And I think that one of the key markers going forward also is going to be who becomes the next director of CDER. And that person, whoever fills that role, will have an opportunity to shape drug development for a decade or more. So it's going to be really critical and really interesting to see who's recruited for that position.
Right. And as we've discussed here, just so some of our listeners who haven't been following the roster of FDA as closely as Steve is, Patrizia Cavazzoni, she departed, when was it, Steve? It was
the last day of the Biden administration. She was the CDER director, and she resigned effectively the last day of the Biden administration. There's an acting director of CDER now, and there's an active search that's going on to identify and recruit someone who's going to lead the center.
Yep. I'll drop it into the show notes. You can read Steve's, we call it an exit interview with Cavazzoni, and she really sketches out what she believes the priorities for FDA. And along with Peter Mark's position, she obviously, that role is the other key role at FDA. Much, Steve has said this before, much more so than whoever is running FDA, because these are the people that are approving the drugs, setting the policy. All right, let's move on. We're obviously going to be talking about this quite a bit over the coming weeks, years, but IPOs, we've been looking for them. As our colleague Stephen Hansen wrote, the expectation was that the IPO market would be opening up at the start of this year. The Fed has fiddled with its interest rate policy a little bit. What are we seeing, Paul, in terms of biotech IPOs getting out on NASDAQ?
Well, after that kind of bleak segment, I wish I had something really sunny to say, and I'm not sure I do. It
It's
feels
always
like
sunny in Gainesville, Florida, Paul, is it not?
it's not always, but often. It feels like we've been saying this for a while. There have been several times where the sentiment we were hearing was IPOs will come back, but not just yet. Maybe not this half, but next half. I kind of feel like we've been saying that for the past year or more. And as you mentioned, our colleague Stephen Hansen has written there was kind of an emerging bull case and a bear case, which more or less correlated with sooner or later for IPOs to return in full force. And if I may borrow from Stephen, he wrote about this Friday. It seems like thus far the bear case is what's playing out. So we might not see much strength in the IPO window for the next few months. A few companies have tested the waters thus far in the first few weeks of 2025. On NASDAQ, there have been 4 listings by biopharmas. There's Metsera, the metabolic company, Maze, some kidney disease candidates, Ciana, cystic fibrosis company, and Aardvark, which addresses hunger-related disorders, things like Prader-Willi syndrome. And really, so far, only one has gone very well. That's Metsera, which has gained value in the aftermarket. I saw this morning, I think it was up 63% since pricing. They all 4 priced within expectations, but 2 have lost value since then. That's Maze and Aardvark. Ciana is up a couple of dollars, so not too bad. I don't know if it's soon enough to call Metsera an outlier. You're talking about an N of 4. Really it's hard to judge. But more broadly, biotech has continued to underperform other sectors so far this year. And, if investors are feeling less enthused about backing biotechs that are public already, it's harder to make the case for new companies going public.
Paul, you mentioned the bear case. What does that look like?
Well, and again, I'm borrowing from Stephen, but the bear case hinges on a few things. Interest rate cuts seem like they'll be smaller and later than some people had expected. The new administration isn't resolving the uncertainties that keep investors on edge, chaos within the federal agencies, potential for inflation. It all adds up to more of a wait and see mode for biotechs looking to get out. That said, the market for follow-ons has been pretty healthy, and for there to be an IPO window, there has to be a market for follow-ons. We've seen a bunch of public biotechs turn over a card, reveal some positive data, and then raise money. Last month we even had a situation where one company, Akero, announced data in liver fibrosis, and then another one with a candidate in the same class, 89 Bio, was also able to raise money. So that was almost $700 million between the two of them based on one set of clinical results. So what's next? There are a couple more companies waiting in the IPO queue that I'm a little worried about as far as optimism for the sector. Odyssey Therapeutics is an immunology company. They've got an ulcerative colitis program led by a serial entrepreneur named Gary Glick, and also Orion Biotech, which is advancing some ophthalmic therapies for corneal diseases. It's been a month since Odyssey filed its S1. It has not laid out any terms yet. Frankly, I'm starting to wonder whether that company will get out at all or whether it will withdraw. Orion filed its prospectus a week later, January 24th. It has also not proposed any terms. So for those, let me say it again, wait and see. But also, not for nothing, I should mention there was an excellent IPO in Korea. A targeted protein degradation company called Aurum raised about $35 million US. It may not sound like that much, but it's the biggest IPO for a Korean biopharma on KOSDAQ in a couple of years. And it's done very well in the aftermarket thus far. 3 trading sessions and it's up 84%. It might not be a bellwether. Maybe it's easier to call that one an outlier, but it's a positive data point.
So, Paul, when you say this, what I hear is M&A. So again, coming out of my conversations last week, definitely delayed sense of when the IPO window would open up. Some people, even talking about 2026. but just about everybody going M&A, baby, M&A.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are still holes to fill in big pharma pipelines. There will always be demand for M&A. It does affect pricing, and it also affects private capital flow because companies have to stay private longer. We've written about a few times how there are whole funds set up to keep private companies going when in previous years they might have been able to tap the public markets and they can't now.
Seems a little too rich in a way that one of the companies next up for the IPO market is Odyssey, as Homer taught us. It can be quite a journey back to Ithaca. So hoping for the best for biotech. May we dodge Scylla and Charybdis, lash ourselves to the mast.
You have studied the classics.
You got to look to the classics, the Greeks. We started this conversation before we got on the pod discussing the Greeks, and here we are. Stephen's piece, as Paul has given props to, Back to the Bear Market. It is the latest in our series of editors' perspectives. It's a bracing read, but a good read. Steve, of course, has his story out late last night on what was going on over the weekend at FDA. I'll drop that into the show notes. And Simone's story on her conversation with the great John Maraganore, that is up on our website as well. You can go to biocenturypodcast.com to find these stories. And we will be back next Monday with the latest on what is going on in Washington at FDA, NIH, CDC, and who knows, maybe a little M&A between now and then, maybe another IPO. We'll keep you up to date. Thanks for tuning in. And if you like what you heard today, subscribe to the BioCentury This Week podcast and our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show. Next up, we'll have Simone in conversation with SR1's Simeon George. You can catch that on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.